So, everybody is not you pushed out. Even though explaining it this way at the time that this concept was all over the manifestation community was appropriate for where the level of consciousness was at that time, let me explain to you what's really happening. So, if we think about how the different dimensions work, so you have the first through what we can now conceptualize up to the 11th dimension. I'm sure there's infinite dimensions. The dimensions are stacked on top of each other. So when you look at the first dimension, it's the point, right? The two-dimensional, or the second dimension, is just a bunch of points stacked on top of each other because there's been another dimension added. So you can have more than one point. You can have an infinite number of points along the x-axis and an infinite number of points along the y-axis, but each of those points is a one-dimensional thing, right? So then if you go up to the third dimension, you add the z-axis, right? So now you can have points, infinite points along the x, the y, and the z, and using those points, you can create three-dimensional objects. So then if you go to the 4D, you're adding the time-space continuum, right? So you've got the 3D objects that you were able to build, and now those objects are able to move through space because you've added the concept of time. Then if you go to the fifth dimension, you're above time, right? So you can see all possibilities within a certain reality at once. Once you get to the sixth dimension, you start to add in all the other possible realities and so on and so on. But thinking through how I explain that, everything is stacked on top of itself. So all 2D objects are made up of 1D objects. All 3D objects are made up of an infinite number of 2D objects. All 4D objects are made up of an infinite number of 3D possibilities, possible positions of 3D objects. So as you go up in the dimensions, everything is stacked on top of itself. It's not that it's separate or that you've got to go somewhere to go to another dimension. You just have to expand your consciousness in order to be able to conceptualize the higher dimension. But it already exists right here. The infinite possible versions of my little piece of consciousness exists right here. My ability to switch between those possibilities depends on my ability to conceptualize it or to imagine it. So what does all this have to do with everyone as you pushed out? When you are reality shifting, which is what I found out the cool kids are calling it now, you're selecting from all the infinite possibilities, right? So if you're dealing with other people, there are infinite versions of those other people that exist. So the version that you are experiencing right now, that your consciousness is observing, is one version of that person. All the other infinite versions of that person exists. So when you want someone to behave differently or be different in some way, your imagination, your ability to imagine them doing that is just selecting from one of those other realities. So every time you imagine something that you desire, whether it's a behavior from a person or an emotional experience or whatever, you are simply selecting from realities that already exist. You're not actually changing that person. You are changing the possibility that you're accessing of that person. So that person has infinite possibilities of how they interact with you. You are limited only by your ability to imagine that person being a certain way, because if you're able to imagine that person being a certain way, then you've accessed the reality where they are that person. So really you're dealing with a completely different version of that person. And because this is infinite, right? So for example, I was going back to the different dimensions. Once you go to the second dimension, the number of points on a line on the X and Y axis is infinite that you can create. The smaller you go, the more possibilities you have. You go quantum, the possibilities are endless. So in the 3D and 4D, there are infinite different ways that can go. And we know from the double slit experiment that waves, which is potential energy, convert to matter, which is particles, by observation. So your ability to observe someone acting in a different way gives you access to the reality where that person is behaving that way. So it's not that they're you pushed out. I mean, like I said, that was an easy way for us to be able to try to figure out what was happening as we were changing our experience with people, it's not that they're you pushed out. It's that you are choosing to experience the reality where they're behaving in the way that you imagine that they behave. And this works both ways. Whatever experience we're having with people, it's because we're choosing to observe that particular reality where that person is behaving in that way. If we want to have a different experience with people, we can shift our reality immediately. And when we think about shifting reality, like we think about reality as this complete thing, right? Like if I look back at my life, I remember, the elementary school I went to, the names of my friends, and the college I went to, and all this stuff. But really, each of those experiences was me selecting different realities. Like the possible combinations are also endless. So you can shift to a reality where just one person is behaving differently. You can shift to a reality where 50 people are behaving differently. As long as you can conceptualize it, the only reason that you can conceptualize a change is because it already exists. And this is something like it takes in order to like really be able to embody this and understand it, it's like an understanding at a soul level, right? But all possibilities already exist. That's just the nature of our reality. The reason why we don't think that all the possibilities exist is because for the most part our consciousness is right at the 4D where the time space is introduced. If we take our consciousness up a few levels, all those realities are stacked on top of each other, and immediate change can be experienced because in each moment, what we're choosing to observe determines which reality we are selecting for ourselves to experience. This happens whether we are aware of it or not. So understanding this mechanism and understanding how powerful our imagination is, and taking that and knowing that we can select from an infinite number of possibilities is paramount. Like, we're only limited by our ability to imagine. And then even if we imagine something, some of us will still limit ourselves. Let's say we want someone's behavior to change and we imagine them behaving that way. We may immediately tell ourselves, no, that's not possible, and bring ourselves back to the version of that person that we're currently experiencing, not knowing that the other version is not, it's them, but it's them in another reality. And we have full access to that. And if we can just believe that, or know that rather, then we can experience a different version of that person. And the only thing that's limiting us is our own imagination, our own limiting beliefs. Now, we talk about limiting beliefs as though they're always a bad thing, but they actually help our reality seem cohesive. Because if we were constantly thinking about the fact that we're selecting from an infinite number of realities, every decision we make, every time we choose to focus our attention in any direction, we're making a selection. Just imagine an infinite number of little toys in front of you, and every time you focus your attention on something, it's like you're grabbing a certain toy. If we were constantly aware of that, it would be overwhelming, and most of us would probably literally go insane. And I feel like that's what happens when people lose their minds. Their consciousness goes to a level that it's not quite ready for, and what they're experiencing is not necessarily being crazy, but their experience is just not cohesive. And so limiting beliefs help us, like this mind that we have to experience the 3D/4D helps us to have a cohesive experience. So it's not a bad thing, but once we understand how this whole thing works, we know that people aren't us pushed out. We're literally selecting versions of people from infinite possibilities, including versions of ourselves. So I hope this made sense. Give me a like, a subscribe, share your comments below, and let me know what you think.